You've heard this story, but you haven't heard what they were actually building. The people of Babel built a tower to heaven. God punished their pride. That structure wasn't built for humans to climb to God. It was a ziggurat, an ancient temple platform built for a god to come down, and archaeologists have found the one in Babylon they were likely building. Think about that for a second. Every painting, every children's Bible, every flannel board lesson shows humans climbing toward the sky. The direction is backwards. The room at the top of one of these temple platforms wasn't a lookout. It held a bed, food, and incense. It was a guest room, set up for a god to arrive. Michael B. Hundley, a scholar who studied how these ancient temples worked, describes them as places prepared for a god to visit, not towers for humans to climb. And between 1899 and 1917, a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey dug up the city of Babylon and uncovered the foundation of a massive ziggurat called Etemenanki, which translates to Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. Not tower to heaven, Temple of the Foundation. It was a place of worship, not a climbing project. It's not that Sunday school made this up. It's that a ziggurat is hard to draw on a felt board. A tall tower reaching to the sky is simple. A temple platform built for a god to visit is not. If the builders weren't trying to reach heaven, what were they actually afraid of? And if its top in the heavens wasn't a building plan, why do the same words appear carved in stone across the ancient world? Most importantly, if God scattered them, and scattering was what he told them to do in the first place, was this really a punishment? When someone builds a wall around their yard, your first thought isn't how ambitious. It's what are they keeping out? The builders of Babel weren't reaching for the sky. They were digging in. Genesis chapter 11 verse 4 gives their reason in their own words. And it's not what you'd expect. They say, "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." Stop and notice that word, lest. That's not ambition. That's fear. They weren't trying to impress God. They were trying to avoid something. And here's why that matters. One chapter earlier, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, God gives Noah and his sons a direct command. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Fill the earth. Spread out. Go everywhere. The builders knew the command, and they refused it. They settled in one place, started a construction project, and said out loud that they were doing it to avoid the very thing God told them to do. The city and the tower weren't monuments to ambition. They were anchors, designed to keep everyone in one place forever. If you grew up hearing that God punished them for being arrogant, the text has a surprise for you. Their own stated reason was fear. The text doesn't describe proud builders shaking their fists at heaven. It describes frightened people clinging together on a plane, building something to make sure they'd never have to leave. So where did the pride reading come from? It's not in Genesis. It comes from later Jewish writings. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish book written centuries after Genesis, added the pride angle. The Talmud, a collection of Jewish commentary and discussion, expanded on it. And Philo, a Jewish thinker who lived around the time of Jesus, took it even further. Sunday school inherited a later reading, not the original text. None of this means your Sunday school teacher was trying to mislead you. It means a reading from centuries later became the default and the original just got left behind. But if the text never says they were proud, where did the most famous part of the story come from? The phrase "it's top in the heavens" sounds like the ultimate act of arrogance, unless you know where else those words appear. If someone today described their new house as a palace fit for a king, you wouldn't call a real estate appraiser. You'd understand, it's just how people talk. The ancient world had the same habit, especially when it came to temples. The phrase "it's top in the heavens" appears in Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. It sounds like a real claim about how tall the building would be. Most scholars who study this period don't read it that way. It was a standard bragging line. Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian king who destroyed Jerusalem and carried the Israelites off into captivity, left his own words carved in stone about Etemenanki, the ziggurat at Babylon. Those words read, "I raised its top to heaven," the same phrase, carved in stone, for a building that stood about 90 meters tall, impressive, but not touching the sky. He wasn't the only one. Tiglath Pileser I, an Assyrian king, described his temple the same way. Hammurabi, a famous Babylonian king and lawmaker, called his temple like the dwelling place of heaven. These were bragging lines. The ancient version of world-class or state-of-the-art, picture that. The same exact words, carved in stone by a real king, for the real building archaeologists dug up in Babylon. Once you know this was just a formula, the Sunday school reading falls apart on its own. Nobody thinks Nebuchadnezzar actually touched the sky. The Babel builders were using the same bragging language. If you're realizing how much of this story you were never told, subscribe. We do this every week. So, here's where we are. The tower was never a tower. It was a ziggurat, a temple platform built for a god to come down, not for humans to climb up. The builders weren't motivated by pride. Their own words in verse 4 say they were afraid of being scattered, and the phrase, "its top in the heavens," wasn't a building plan. It was a bragging line that every king in that part of the world stamped on every temple they built. So if the story isn't about proud humans trying to storm heaven, what is it actually about? That's where Genesis chapter 11 verse 6 comes in. When a parent takes the car keys away from a teenager, it's rarely about the car, it's about where the teenager was planning to drive. God's response to Babel wasn't about the building, it was about the direction. God's stated reason for stepping in is in verse 6, and most people have never read it carefully. The text says, "Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." Think about what that means. There's no mention of pride, no mention of arrogance, no mention of being offended. God's concern is what they could do together. Unified human power, all aimed in the wrong direction. If you were taught that God was punishing their pride, read verse 6 one more time. The word pride isn't there. What's there is something more interesting. God saw that a unified humanity refusing to spread out could accomplish anything, and anything included refusing the plan he'd already laid out. The pride reading makes God sound petty, like he's threatened by a building. The actual text makes God sound like a parent redirecting a stubborn family, moving them toward the purpose he'd already set. And there's a detail in verse 5 that most readers miss completely. The text says God came down to see the city and the tower. Stop and picture that. A building whose top was supposedly in the heavens required God to come down just to notice it. The text is making a joke, and it's doing it on purpose. Think about a family where the parents tell their grown children it's time to move out and start their own lives. And instead of leaving, the kids renovate the basement, soundproof the walls, and install a new kitchen. Not because they love the house, but because they're terrified of what's out there. That's Babel. The building project was never an act of ambition. It was a wall against the future God had already planned. If God's response was to scatter them, and scattering was what he told them to do in the first place, was this really a punishment? Every empire names itself something grand, and every conquered people finds a way to make fun of that name. The Israelites were no exception. The city at the center of this story had a name. In the Babylonian language, it was called Bab-Elim. It meant Gate of God. That was the official name, the place where heaven meets earth, the doorway between the human and the divine. The Hebrew author of Genesis takes that name and flips it. In Hebrew, Babel sounds like the word Balal, which means to confuse. Same sound, opposite meaning. The gate of God becomes the city of confusion. That joke would have hit a lot harder if you'd just spent 70 years as Babylon's prisoner. For the Israelite audience living in captivity, the period when Babylon conquered Jerusalem and forced them to live there as prisoners, this wasn't just a clever play on words. It was the sharpest line in Genesis. The empire that called itself Heaven's front door is revealed, in their own scriptures, to be the place where God made everyone confused. If you grew up hearing Babel and thinking it was just an old place name, you missed the punchline. The original audience didn't miss it. They would have caught it right away. Imagine living under the boot of an empire that branded itself as the gateway between heaven and earth, and then hearing a story where God turns that name into a word for chaos. This isn't a detail Sunday school skipped on purpose. It's a detail that only lands if you know the people hearing this story were living as captives in Babylon. Without that, It's just an old name. With it, it's the sharpest line in the whole book of Genesis. So if the scattering was God's plan all along, was Babel really a punishment story? There's a certain kind of ending where the thing the characters tried hardest to prevent is exactly what happens. Not as a twist, but because it was always the point. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. God says, "Fill the earth." Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. The builders say, "Lest we be scattered." Genesis chapter 11, verses 8 and 9. God scatters them. The text states it twice. The thing they feared most is exactly what God did, and it's exactly what God told them to do before they started building. If you grew up hearing this as a story about punishment, look at what actually happens. God doesn't rain fire. He doesn't send a flood. He does the one thing the builders were trying to prevent. He sends them out, into the earth, exactly where he said to go in chapter 9. Notice what that means. The punishment accomplished the original command. The judgment and the purpose are the same event. God didn't destroy what they built out of anger. He moved them into the future they were trying to avoid. The Sunday school version ends with a warning. Don't be prideful, or God will knock you down. The actual text ends with something stranger and richer. A community so afraid of God's plan that they poured everything into staying put, and a God who scattered them anyway, not to punish their ego, but to get them where he'd always wanted them to go. That changes the whole shape of the story. It's not a warning about arrogance. It's a story about people choosing the safety of what they knew over the uncertainty of what God had planned, and God choosing the plan anyway. Next time you see this story in a children's Bible, the tall tower, the proud builders, the angry God, remember what the text actually describes: a temple, not a tower; fear, not pride; and a scattering that was never the punishment. It was the plan. If this changed how you see this story, subscribe. There's a lot more the Sunday school version left out.